Good morning and welcome to this fabulous Sunday, 14th of November, Health Matters. I'm Marina. I am Programming Director at Emanuel, and I know hopefully a lot of you. Today we're with Dr. Hugh Mackay, AO, and Rabbi Jacqueline Ninio on a really wonderful topic about kindness. So I'd like to say thank you, and I hope you enjoy this morning's conversation. Rabbi Ninio, over to you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and although we had the acknowledgement of country at the beginning on that first slide, I would again like to just acknowledge that many of us are on the land of the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and if you would like to write the lands on which you are. I know, Hugh, you are in Canberra, so which land are you on?
The Ngunnawal people.
And we offer respect to First Nations people and their leaders past, present and emerging. We are grateful to have Dr. Hugh Mackay here with us this morning. He has had a 60-year career as a social researcher, 25 years as a weekly columnist in the newspaper. He's a best-selling author of 22 books, and what is little known is 8 novels amongst them, and he's working on his next novel now, so hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit towards the end. He is an incredible mind and thinker doing social analysis, psychology, communication and ethics. He has honorary doctorates at 5 universities, is a fellow of the Australian Psychological Society, the Royal Society of New South Wales, currently honorary professor at the Research School of Psychology at Australian National University, and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2015. So we are so grateful. We could spend most of the time just recalling all of Hugh's achievements and successes, but we are grateful to have you here this morning. And my bookshelf is filled with many of those 22 books that you have written, but today we're going to focus, at the beginning at least, on your latest book, The Kindness Revolution, and you're going to share with us a little bit about how we can be involved in this kindness revolution and what that is all about. So just to let everyone know the format for this morning, Dr. Mackay is going to speak for about 20 minutes at the beginning, 25, just sharing with us some of his thoughts and the things about which he has been thinking and sharing through his book and through his research and associations with looking at the world the way it has been now. Then we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of those issues in a little bit more depth, and then we will open it up to all of you for questions and comments. So please, anytime you have a question, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will keep a record of them, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to answer them all. So we turn over now to you, Hugh, and we thank you again very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you. I'm sorry we're not in person, but this is the next best thing, of course, and we're all getting used to that, aren't we? Zoom, we become Zoombies, a friend of mine says. I want to begin by saying something that may seem so obvious, so self-evident that you're wondering why I would even bother to say it. But I want to just remind us all that as human beings, we are members of a social species. Like many other species on the planet, members of this species are hopeless in isolation. We could not survive if we were isolated from each other. We absolutely need families, neighbourhoods, faith communities, work colleagues, groups, communities of all kinds to nurture us and sustain us, and to give us that all-important sense of belonging that is so fundamental to our mental and emotional health because we belong to a social species. In other words, the future of our species, the capacity of our species to survive, let alone thrive, depends on us being able to create and maintain social harmony. So it's reassuring to know from neuroscientists who can now peep into our brains in the way that psychologists and philosophers could previously only speculate about. Neuroscientists tell us that you can find in the human brain the cooperative centre. There is a part of the brain where we are hardwired for cooperation. And what that means, of course, by implication, is that we have an innate capacity for kindness. Since kindness towards each other, respect towards each other, the ability to show compassion towards each other, these are the absolutely crucial ingredients in cooperation. When we cooperate in this glorious project of creating and maintaining social harmony, kindness is probably the critical ingredient. So it's in us. That doesn't mean that we are all born kind. It means we're all born with the capacity for kindness, same as we're all born with the capacity for language. It doesn't mean from the moment we're born we can speak the mother tongue. It needs to be nurtured and encouraged and reinforced. And that's the same with kindness. We're born with the capacity, but it does need attention. It does need nurturing. So let's define it. We all talk glibly about kindness. Maybe we all know what we mean, but let's try a definition. Again, based on the proposition that we belong to a social species, the deepest social need that we all have, the deepest psychological need we all have, is the need to be taken seriously, the need to be heard, the need to be appreciated, the need to be understood, the need to be noticed, the need to be included. I'd put all that under the heading of our need to be taken seriously. So I would define kindness as anything we do to show another person that we take them seriously. Anything we do that says to another person, I notice you, I appreciate you, I acknowledge you, I hear you. That's what kindness is. Now that can be almost anything. It can be a smile. It can be a wave. It can be saying hello to someone as you pass a total stranger in the street. In fact, that moment when you pass that stranger and smile and acknowledge them and say hello might just be the moment where your act of kindness, trivial though it may seem, was the thing they needed to bring them back from the brink of despair or loneliness or a feeling of being ignored or overlooked. So it can be that. It can be asking someone to have a cup of coffee, inviting someone home for a meal, being prepared to listen to someone who has something to say to you. In fact, I think I'd say if there was one thing that we could all do to sharpen up our capacity for kindness, it would be to become more attentive, more empathic listeners. When we listen to each other, you're courteously listening to me at the moment. You don't have much choice, courtesy of the technology, but thank you for listening. But when someone listens to us, what that's saying to us, without needing to put it into words, is, I take you seriously enough to bother listening to what you have to say. I'm going to entertain your ideas. I'm going to acknowledge that you have something you want to share with me. And that's therapeutic. But think about the opposite. Think about what happens when someone is trying to talk to you and you're only half listening, or you're looking at your watch, or you're looking over their shoulder in the hope of catching sight of someone more interesting to talk to. The unspoken message is, I'm sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening to what you have to say. Now, would you ever say that to a partner or a colleague or a child or a neighbour or a friend? Of course you wouldn't. It'd be so hurtful, it'd be so offensive. And yet, when we withhold the gift of listening, when we behave unkindly by refusing to listen or refusing to listen properly, that is the message that we send. So any act of kindness, listening, and all the other things we think of that we do to express kindness towards another person, all acts of kindness are therapeutic. And in fact, the impact of kindness on each other, on our neighbourhood, on our culture, on our society is so great that I think of kindness as the most precious, the capacity for kindness as the most precious asset humans have. We don't always value it. It can be easily pushed aside by ego-driven desires, by competitiveness or ambition or acquisitiveness. There are lots of things, that busyness, that can get in the way of our capacity for kindness. But when we're being true to what Abraham Lincoln described as the better angels of our nature, then we act kindly. I think of kindness as being the purest form of human love. Now, all forms of human love are wonderful, aren't they? Romantic love is exciting and energizing, and familial love is remarkable. Blood is thicker than water. Companionate love sustains us. Where would we be without the love of our friends? But there's this unique form of love, which we'll call kindness, different from all the others in this important respect, that it does not involve the emotions. It does not spring from affection. Our capacity for kindness, and I think in a way this is perhaps the loveliest thing you can say about the species we belong to, means that we are capable of showing kindness towards people we don't like. We're capable of showing kindness towards people we could never agree with. It's absolutely possible to have a robust discussion, a robust disagreement, a conflict with someone, and yet to manage it kindly, as so many people so wonderfully do. It's possible for us to show kindness towards total strangers. Isn't that a lovely thing to know about us? That we can be kind to people we don't know. We don't qualify people. You see someone who's in a jam. There's an elderly person. Their shopping bag has burst. Their shopping is all over the footpath. It's pouring with rain. You don't say, "Oh boy, I'm running a bit late. I think I'll let someone else look after that person." And you don't qualify them, do you? You don't say, "Oh, I see you're in a bit of a jam here with your shopping. Now look, before I offer to help, I need to know how you voted in the last election. Or would you mind telling me where you stand on some religious question?" No, someone needs a hand, we give them a hand because we're humans. That's what humans do. Kindness comes naturally to us when we are being true to our human nature. Now, bearing all that in mind, just ponder for a moment what's been happening to our society and Western societies comparable to ours. But let's just think of Australia. Think about what's been happening to Australia over the last 30 or 40 years. This has been, of course, a period of enormous social and cultural and economic and demographic change and upheaval, really. And when you look at the sort of changes that have been reshaping our society, the remarkable thing is that they are changes, and we've participated in them. We know what these changes are because we've made them happen. I mean, we're members of the society. But the cumulative effect of these changes, and I'll briefly describe them in a moment, is to push us in precisely the opposite direction from the one I've been describing, to push us away from our sense of being members of a social species, of sharing a common humanity, of needing each other, in the direction of becoming more socially fragmented, or as the sociologists call it, more atomized. Becoming a society with unprecedented levels of social isolation and erosion of social cohesion. It hasn't happened. I mean, it's not a complete thing. I'm not talking about something that's final and we've gone in that direction. I'm talking about a process of moving in that direction, taking us away from our true nature as humans who need each other. Let me just very quickly run through 5 or 6 of what these trends are. I won't discuss them. We can explore them later if you need to, but you'll be familiar with them as soon as I describe them. Think about our shrinking households. Australian households have been shrinking steadily for 100 years. In the last 100 years, our population has increased 5-fold. The number of households in Australia has increased 10-fold. So we're growing households at twice the rate we're growing the population, which means they're getting smaller. The average Australian household is now 2.5 people. The fastest growing household type, which already accounts for more than a quarter of all households, is the single person household. 1 in 4 households contain just one person. The Bureau of Statistics says within the next 10 to 15 years, that'll be 1 household in 3 contains just one person. Now, not everyone who lives alone is socially isolated or lonely, of course. There are many people who love living alone, who are living alone by choice, and who say, I've got all my friends, I've got family, I've got work colleagues, I can mingle with people whenever I like. I come home, I shut the door, I punch the air, and I say, alone at last. This is my symbol of freedom and independence. Well, that's some people. But many people who live alone don't feel like that at all. They're living alone because of circumstances beyond their control, bereavement, relationship breakdown, a relocation that's taken them away from a previous family household, whatever it might be. And many of those people don't like living alone and do feel at risk of being socially isolated. We'll say a little bit more about that later. So that's one huge change, probably the biggest demographic change in Australia's history. Another trend is our sustained high rate of relationship breakdown. Between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages will end in divorce. Again, that's an unprecedented figure. This is a new feature of our society. And that's, of course, hugely disruptive and contributes to social fragmentation. Not painful, difficult not only for the couple who are separating, for their families, their extended families, their friendship circles, their neighbourhood groups and so on, but also, of course, for children, if there are children involved, and there often are, which is why we have currently 1 million dependent children in Australia who are living with just one of their natural parents. That's getting close to a quarter of the child population, by the way. So that's a hugely disruptive, dislocating factor. And of course, if it's a couple who split, a 2-person household, at least for a while, becomes 2 single-person households. So that contributes to that trend as well. I mentioned kids. I'll quickly add to this little list our falling birth rate. Relative to total population, Australia is currently producing the smallest generation of children we've ever produced in our history. And I mention that purely because any of you who are parents know if you move into a new neighbourhood, it's usually the kids who act as a kind of social lubricant. The kids get to know other kids on the school bus or in the playground or at the park, and gradually the families get to know each other. Well, when we have such a relatively tiny generation of children, that social lubricant is in shorter supply than ever. We're compensating, of course, if you compare the graph of our falling birth rate with the graph of our rising rate of pet ownership, you can see how we're dealing with the child drought. Some people take their dogs to the dog walking park, and that's how the dogs get to know each other, and then the owners do. Well, that's another subject. Very quickly, just a few other trends. Our increasing mobility. Just like Americans now, Australians are moving house on average once every 6 years. And of course, we're more mobile also in the sense of universal car ownership. Most of us live in drive-in, drive-out suburbs where you wave at your neighbour's car. You assume your neighbour is driving, but it's very different from stopping and saying good day on the footpath. Busyness, I'd add to this list. Busyness is the great enemy of social cohesion. And yet, isn't it amazing how we've adopted busyness as a kind of social virtue? You know, how are you going, Jackie? Busy? As though, come on, are you busy or are you dead? The switch is on or off. Well, it's madness. Busyness is the great enemy of social cohesion. The neighbours are having drinks on Friday. Sorry, too busy. Don't disturb Daddy, he's too busy. But it's got us by the throat at the moment. Even retired people say, I'm so busy, I don't know how I ever found time to go to work. I feel like saying to them, why? It doesn't have to be like that. And the other thing I'd add to this list, and of course the list could go on all morning, but one other thing to add is our enthusiastic embrace of information technology, often at the expense of interpersonal relationships. It's a paradox, isn't it? The IT revolution promised to make us more connected than ever before, and it has. For example, this connection right now. But at the same time, it's made it easier than ever to stay apart from each other. And in fact, the heaviest users of social media, the 18 to 25 age group, report the highest levels of loneliness in our community. So you can be connected but lonely if the connection is not of the human face-to-face kind. Well, I'll stop that little lightning tour through social change right there. But just ponder the cumulative effect of that. Think of all those factors that I just described and think about what that would do to a society if that trend, those trends cumulatively continued. Obviously, it would make us a less cohesive society. It would promote individualism, which it has done. The rise of the so-called me culture, the obsession with identity politics, religious identity, cultural identity, ethnic identity, political identity. And of course, identity is important to us as individuals, but identity is all about how we're different. It's all about how we're separate, how we're unique. It's not about our sense of common humanity. So if a society goes through a period like that, what's going to happen? We can predict what's going to happen. It's no puzzle at all. We are going to be afflicted by the three epidemics that we have been afflicted by long before the pandemic arrived, namely our epidemics of loneliness, anxiety, and depression. Well, there's as I say, a lightning trip through the last 30 or 40 years, but now we come to the present. Let's start 2020, the bushfires, closely followed by the pandemic, and in 2021, we're still dealing with the pandemic, of course. What has this done? What it's done is remind us of what it really means to be human. It's done what crises and catastrophes almost always do, which is remind us that our independence is all very well when everything's going swimmingly, but as soon as there's an emergency, we recognize our interdependence. We initially might give way to fear and panic and behave badly in the face of a catastrophe, whether it's a war or a depression, or a pandemic or a fire or a flood or a personal crisis involving a relationship breakdown or a health issue or whatever it might be. Fear and panic. But almost always, for almost all of us, those initial responses give way to kindness, compassion, a recognition of the fact that we have to make personal sacrifices for the common good. A renewal of our appreciation of the importance of the local neighbourhood. All of these things come to the fore when we're dealing with a crisis. And the question, of course, with COVID is, has the disruption been great enough? It's been enormous for people who've caught the virus, for people whose businesses have been destroyed or severely damaged. But generally speaking, the question is, has the crisis been shocking enough, been disruptive enough to mitigate the effects of those social trends that I was talking about? We have learned a lot, haven't we, already from COVID? We've learned the value of neighbours. We've all had a taste of social isolation and realised we didn't like that. And perhaps that's reminded us that in our midst, there are people at permanent risk of social isolation, and perhaps we need to be far more attentive to them. We've realised if we were able to work from home, that you can work from home, and maybe we can have a kind of hybrid working arrangement where we don't sit in 2 hours a day of commuter traffic, but we do our some work from home, some work at the workplace if that's possible, and life can be a little less stressful, a little simpler. In fact, the whole big lesson we've learned out of the pandemic is it's possible to de-stress. It's possible to simplify. We've learned to be more cooperative, and because of our heavy reliance on information technology through this period, we've learned that it's not as good as the real thing, haven't we? We couldn't wait to get out and hug people and to make eye contact with people and to restore human interaction the way it occurs naturally, not via a screen. So the big question is, are we going to internalize these lessons? Are we going to generalize? Having been reminded of our essential nature, will that affect the way we'll live from now? Will it affect our society? Will we adopt kindness as a way of life, and will the rising tide of kindness finally reach the ballot box? Will we affect the political culture? Imagine if Australia became known as a loving country, not just a lucky country. Wow, what kind of a society would we be? We'd make a much more energetic attempt to effect reconciliation with our First Nations people, wouldn't we? We'd have a far more humane response to people who've come here perfectly legitimately seeking asylum. We'd have a more determined effort to eradicate poverty and homelessness, not just reduce them, but eradicate them. We'd be taking far more urgent action to mitigate the effects of climate change. We'd be far more generous to people for whom we can find no work, people struggling with mental illness or other forms of disability. If we were a more loving country, we'd be taking far better care of our frail aged. We'd be tackling the growing problem of educational inequality. We'd be insisting on more courtesy, more kindness in the conduct of our politics and industrial relations and so on. Well, that's another whole subject, but let's bring it all right back to our own front door, to our own households, our own families, our own immediate neighbourhoods, our own workplace, our own faith community, wherever we personally are operating. And let me ask you this just to conclude before we start talking about some of these issues. Do you ever dream of a different kind of Australian society? You ever dream of a different kind of neighbourhood to live in? I'm sure you do sometimes. Perhaps on a quiet, reflective Sunday afternoon, you think, well, things don't have to be like this. Politics could be different. The neighbourhood could be different. Our society. But when you have those dreams, do you ever think, I wish there was more violence? Why are people so nice to each other all the time? Why don't people just say what they think? You don't dream that, do you? What you dream is of a kinder, more compassionate, more cooperative, more respectful, more inclusive, more egalitarian, more harmonious, less violent, less cynical society. And if you do dream of that, there is actually a way for us to make Australia into that kind of society, and that is by each of us starting to live now, today, starting to live as if it is that kind of society. If enough of us start living as if it is that kind of society, that's the kind of society it will become. Remember that revolutions never start at the top. It's always at the grassroots. It's always people like us deciding we're going to live differently that will bring about the transformation and turn this crisis into a revolution. Thank you, Jackie.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hugh. And I just kind of want to pick up on that last point because there have been a number of questions and comments already coming, connecting to the politics. They say, you know, it's fine for us to feel this way, but they don't feel that in terms of kindness the politicians are listening, like the people who are making the big decisions are kind of listening to us. And I hope that I, Devora, encapsulate what you're saying as well. If not, then please write back again. But she was talking about that politics privileges a small group of people, disenfranchises many, and she was speaking about building developments and things, the way that we're constructing our neighborhoods with big buildings that disconnect people from each other, block out light and sun, and what's the effect of that, and how do we kind of get people to listen. And then someone else said they feel that politicians are not doing that act of kindness by listening and acknowledging all the concerns that are around. So what can we do? You've kind of touched on it, but maybe a little bit more deeply.
Yes, thank you to those questioners. They're fundamental, aren't they, to the way our democracy is operating. My utopian democracy is a place where, when any social or economic policy is brought forward for consideration, the first criterion that's applied in assessing it is this kind? Is this fair? If it passes the kindness and fairness test, then let's talk about it. And if not, it's off the table. That is not the situation. Of course, we rarely hear the word kindness uttered in politics. And in fact, thanks to the British Parliament that we inherited, we still call it the Mother Parliament, rather bizarrely. But we have a parliamentary system which is adversarial by nature. We have a government and an opposition, and they sit on opposite sides of the chamber and talk as if they are opponents. Now, built in, if you have the system constructed for opposition, constructed for adversarialism, then it becomes a contest, it becomes competitive. Elections are about winning and losing, and people who win an election think, I've won, you've lost, winner take all, etc. It's a terrible way to run a democracy, and it's not the only way. There are many other countries around the world who handle it differently, and I notice looming for the next election, there's a major movement around Australia to promote independent members of the federal parliament at the next election. Whether that will fundamentally alter the character of the parliament, we'll have to wait and see. But you can see the motivation for that. The people who are running that movement are saying, we don't like an adversarial system in which the finer, the nobler human qualities are brushed aside in the heat of this adversarial contest, everything a contest, a competition. So I think as voters, we've got to start talking about this. We've got to start saying to people who are candidates in our electorates, where do you stand on kindness? And they'll look at you as if you've gone mad. But I think we've got to start saying we want a different kind of politics in Australia. We want some of the policies that we are ashamed of in relation to First Nations people, or treatment of the frail elderly, or treatment of asylum seekers in offshore detention centres, or all the things I mentioned in that little list, Jackie. We're not proud of that. That's not the kind of country we think we are. And we so often see in research the community being far ahead of parliamentarians when it comes to these humanitarian issues. I think we've got to demand better, but members of parliament don't know how we feel about this unless we tell them. If they don't hear from us, they assume that we think everything must be okay. And when a government is returned, they think, but terrific, everyone loves us, we've been returned. And of course, it's not that simple. So I would urge all of us to include politics in our determination to live differently and to make our voices heard on the subject of kindness and fairness in particular.
I think also kindness and fairness have become words that are considered weak. They're not powerful words that, powerful, strong people don't make decisions based on that. And I think that's part of the change of perception that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Kindness, and one of the good things about the raising the profile of kindness is we can challenge this idea. And by the way, we should note in passing, yesterday was apparently World Kindness Day. I'm not sure who declared it such, but anyway, here we are the day after. Yes, it's very easy to think of kindness as some kind of soft quality, as though if you're kind, you're just some sort of pathetic pushover, oh, you do what people want you to do and agree with everybody. It's absolute rubbish. The fact that kindness is uncoupled from our emotions makes it possible for kindness to be a really strong quality. You can speak your mind kindly. You can discipline a child kindly. You can disagree vehemently with what someone is saying, provided you first understood what they're saying and acknowledged that that's what they think, and you can disagree kindly. Kindness is one of the strongest human qualities because it allows us to be ourselves, it allows us to be strong, it allows us to be decisive, but to do it in a way that preserves social harmony.
Yeah, there is a very strong Jewish principle actually called an argument for the sake of heaven. And so they say it's like in Judaism, we quite often joke that there are two people, two Jews and three opinions. And we spend a lot of time debating and arguing. And that is considered a very healthy, good thing if it's done with respect and with that kindness towards the person you disagree with. And you disagree with the ideas, not with the human being. And I think with social media, we've found an explosion of anger, which is what I promised Donald. There is another question, and I will get to it, I promise. But I just wanted to sort of look at this idea of anger in the community a little bit, because I feel like after the first lockdown, and I'm speaking very much, I think, from a Sydney experience, and I don't know how widespread it is, but I think after the first lot of lockdowns, we saw this explosion, like you said, of neighbours connecting with each other and realising how important all these things were that we were taking for granted. And there was kind of this real reaching out to each other. And I feel like with the second lockdown, there's been this simmering anger and disagreement and kind of conflict that's happening. And I'm wondering if you have anything to comment about that. Where is it coming from? What can we do? Why the difference? Why the change?
Yes, thanks, Jackie. And you mentioned social media in the beginning of that question. Let's start with that. One of the reasons why, there are a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons why there's so much anger, so much bullying, so much unkindness, flaming, as it's called, by some people, trolling, all of that stuff in social media, is because if we're spending too much time interacting with a screen rather than with each other, face to face with eye contact, then we are depriving ourselves of a crucial ingredient in human health. And that crucial ingredient is face-to-face interpersonal contact, incorporating actual eye contact, not feeling as if you're looking at someone on a screen, you're just looking at a screen. But neuroscientists are now able to tell us that in the same way as humans, in order for humans to stay healthy, we have to eat properly every day, we have to exercise properly every day, and we need social interaction, face-to-face, every day. Now, if you are hungry and you don't eat, you tend to get angry. Hangry is the word. Irritable, cranky. You don't even know why. I mean, sometimes I find this myself. I'm getting irritable and cranky, and then I have lunch and I feel fine. Everything's. And I think, am I so powerfully ruled by my gut? Well, the answer is yes. We are. The gut is really part of the brain and central nervous system. But there's this sense of crankiness and anger, and we don't know where it's coming from, but it's coming from in the case of social media, heavy use of not condemning social media at all, valuable in many ways, but the overuse means we're depriving ourselves of the daily dose that we need of interpersonal face-to-face contact, and that brings out an angry response of which people are generally not conscious. I mean, they don't know where it came from. They don't know why they're cranky, but out comes all this anger. And so what you described, Jackie, during the second lockdown and in Melbourne during the 7, whatever it was, lockdowns, so much social isolation, so much deprivation of face-to-face contact that without even understanding why people do. I mean, the first time it was a bit of a novelty and we quite enjoyed having all that peace and quiet. But when it went on, I think we didn't fully understand that. I mean, in our criminal justice system, solitary confinement is the worst punishment we can think of to inflict on a prisoner, because it is the worst punishment for a member of a social species. Well, we've all experienced to some extent during the lockdowns a bit of solitary confinement, and not if you're living with other people, although that can be testing too. But a lot of people, particularly people living alone, experienced something tantamount to solitary confinement. And of course, it's very hard to deal with that. A herd animal cut off from the herd is likely to behave badly. So I think that's a phenomenon we have to watch. There have been many important lessons we've learned from the pandemic. Some of them, as you said, are good things. You know, we have learned to reach out to neighbours and to remember to pick lemons and give them to the old guy on the corner. But it has reminded us of some dark things that can happen to us when our normal social interactions that are so fundamental to this sense of belonging, when those normal social interactions are inhibited.
That leads very interestingly into a question that has been asked, that is kindness, you talk about it being part of the innate sort of sense of being human, but the question is, if someone does not experience kindness during their early development, is there like a window that closes that means that they won't, that sort of aspect of them will be shut down, or can later experiences of kindness kind of reverse that? Is our ability to be kind dependent on the kindness that has been shown to us?
Yeah, another wonderful question. There is no doubt that if children are not shown kindness, if they're not modeled, kindness is not modeled for them, and their own capacity for kindness is not nurtured and developed, then it's very unlikely that they will spontaneously become kind. But it seems that it's never a lost cause. It gets harder and harder. The window does close, but it can be prized open, but it takes a lot of love. There's the famous study that was done on children in an orphanage in World War II, I think it was, who were just never cuddled, never picked up, never shown any sort of physical affection or experienced any real kindness during their formative years, and their life expectancy was shorter than the average. And we know that the social consequence, that the health consequences of social isolation, of feeling as if you are alone rather than accepted and embraced and belonging, is not just about loneliness and anxiety and depression. They're the obvious ones, but it's also about the increased risk of hypertension, increased inflammation, sleeplessness, vulnerability to addiction and so on. It's a very, very bad situation for people to be in. So to be somewhat socially isolated in childhood, or at least not to be the recipient of kindness in childhood, is a very isolating thing, a very wounding, damaging thing. And when you find people who are in later life apparently arrogant, cynical, insensitive, lacking in empathy and so on, it's very easy to be judgmental of such people, but a moment's thought will make us realize that there's a human quality that has not been nurtured in them. It's there, but it hasn't been nurtured, and so you're dealing with a wounded person. you're dealing with a damaged person, and the wound can be healed, but it's going to require determined, persistent compassion, which will not be deterred. What I describe in this new book as radical kindness, the sort of kindness that's just going to go on regardless of what you're getting back. And gradually, because the capacity is in all of us, I don't think it ever shrivels up entirely. But boy, you have to work really hard if you're dealing with an adult who's made it through to adulthood without ever having been nurtured, by ever having experienced the therapeutic effect of kindness.
I think that's also an interesting thing is that when I feel like when we're kind, and maybe it's just me, but I get as much back from being that way towards someone else as I hope that they are receiving from the interaction with me. I think it feels good to be kind. So it seems that it should be something that we should, the more we do, the more it will happen. Is that the case? Is it like
Yeah,
a
yes, it is the case, and it's a very, very complicated concept in my mind, Jackie. I mean, the sort of person where that questioner was thinking about, the sort of person who was not nurtured on kindness and who never really learns to be kind, they're missing out on the joy of being kind. Um, so it is therapeutic it's like forgiveness. I mean, forgiveness is a therapeutic experience if you are forgiven, and it's a therapeutic experience if you forgive, because if someone has wronged you, you remain the victim of that wrong until you forgive them, and then you are liberated by forgiveness. So the same is true with kindness, but I tread very carefully on this subject because it's very easy to slip over into something that has actually become very fashionable at the moment, which is to say, if you're a bit depressed or a bit down or something, go out and be kind to someone and you'll feel a whole lot better. Kindness is therapeutic. You want to be happy, be kind. Well, look, there's some truth in this, and there's some research that shows that when we perform acts of kindness, we receive a psychological benefit. And I would personally like to burn that research because it can lead us into completely the wrong motivation. Kindness is not about how it makes us feel. Kindness is all about what we do for other people. It's all about how we make the world a better place. I mentioned earlier the person whose shopping bag burst in the rainstorm and their shopping went everywhere, and you stop and help them pick it all up and send them on their way. Now, you're now soaked to the skin, you're now running late for an appointment, and you're feeling cranky. You're not feeling better. You don't feel all warm and glowing because you did actually make the world a better place, but it didn't feel good. Felt terrible. Um, well, don't be on the lookout for the reward. Be on the lookout for signs that you are helping to make the world a better place. Now, there's some satisfaction in that, of course. I'm not denying that. But even if there were no even if there were no personal benefit in it, it's still the correct way for human beings to behave. In the same way as on ethical and moral issues, there's this terrible slogan that was fashionable in the 80s and seems to have become fashionable again. Good ethics is good business, as though if you behave morally, that will improve the bottom line. Well, it might, and it might not. And what if it doesn't? Does that mean, oh, well, we'll cut a few corners in favour of the bottom line? We won't be too worried about the morality of this. It's an appalling worldview to say that we'll do the right thing because of a benefit we'll get. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. We act kindly towards other people, especially people in obvious need of kindness or even compassion, because they need it. We help the poor because they're poor, not because we're going to feel better. Even the argument that we help the poor because if we were poor, we'd want help. That's all got it all around the wrong way too. That's a very self-centered view. We help the poor because they're poor, full stop. Nothing to do with how we'll feel about helping the poor. It's how they'll feel if they get the benefit of our support.
Thank you. I think Paul was saying is being kind to others essentially a selfish, not a selfless act. And I think you've answered that
Yes.
very clearly right then.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Paul. I think, yeah, we are doing this selflessly. We're suppressing the ego because the ego is the enemy of kindness. The ego wants us to please ourselves, to follow an agenda that will make us feel better, happy, richer, whatever. Kindness is all about saying, "Get back, ego. I'm here as a. I'm celebrating our common humanity. I'm acknowledging that I exist we all exist in a kind of shimmering, vibrating web of interconnectedness and interdependency, in which, yeah, we are independent and we do have a sense of our own identity, of course. That's essential to mental health as well, but it's trivial compared with our sense of common humanity and our responsibility to the other, our responsibility to the neighbour.
So, as someone who is intimately involved in an identity community, I guess, with the synagogue, it's a place to bring people together, and you've talked about the importance of that and having a place and belonging, but also the challenge of being that as well as being part of this common humanity. What are the kinds of things we should ask or do or approach when we are part of any kind of institution or group to ensure that we can be part of that group or the institution? I mean, institutions, I guess, need to exist. So how do they
Absolutely.
and be kind and focus? How do we do that? How do we hold those two things together?
Yes. Thanks, Jackie. Obviously, I have a whole chapter on institutions in the new book because they do hold us together. They are like society's scaffolding. We create institutions in order to preserve values that are important to us, in order to preserve aspects of our identity that are important to us. But institutions are there if they're valid, if they're authentic, if they're good institutions. They are there to promote the common good. They are there to promote social harmony, to promote our sense of common humanity, not our division or our separateness or our uniqueness. So religious communities, religious institutions are in a special category. If you look at the great world religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on, it seems to me the reason why every culture has its religious traditions, and the reason why about 75% of the world's population, including about 65% of Australia's population, choose to identify with one of the world religions, is that religion, perhaps more than any other kind of institution, it exists to promote social harmony. It exists to encourage and nurture our capacity for kindness, our capacity for compassion, to share in the suffering of others, our capacity to show respect even towards people we don't agree with, who don't share our faith, or who don't share our politics, or whatever it might be. So the challenge for any faith community, particularly, as you say, one that's had a long history of being very identity focused, is to say this institution serves the interests of the society that allows it to exist to the extent that it serves the needs of that society. So members of the Emanuel Synagogue congregation need their strong sense of identity, but for this to be a valuable, I'd almost say an authentic social institution, it would require that the members of that congregation be renowned as good neighbours in the wider community. These are the people you can rely on for kindness and compassion and support in a crisis. These are the friendliest people in the street who are always saying hello. And I'd say that of other faith communities as well. If we are not, as people of a particular religious identity, renowned for our love, for our compassion, and for our completely unemotional kindness, what's the point? If the whole exercise is about emphasizing our separateness, our uniqueness, our specialness, and our difference, then this is actually an anti-social movement that is calculated to erode social harmony rather than promote it.
It's tricky, isn't it, the balance as well, because of what you were saying before about being seen and being heard and being noticed and acknowledged for who you are. Like, we want to ensure that that remains a part
Yes.
of all of our interactions with communities and with individuals, but then alongside that, to remember to embrace that common humanity, to
Yes.
see the ways we are different as well as
Yes.
the ways we are the same.
Yes, we all live. I mean, I don't want to sound sort of Pollyanna about this. We all live with the tension between our sense of ourselves as independent, unique individuals and as members of particular groups with a particular identity, the tension between all that and the deeper sense of ourselves as members of this species, as sharing a common humanity with people with whom we have breathtakingly different religious or political or cultural views. They are still part of us. I mean, it's like people talk about homelessness or poverty as though those people over there are homeless or those people over there are suffering from poverty, and perhaps even blaming them for their poverty. There's another frame we need to put around this and say we are homeless. We are poor. That's part of who we are. And those parts of who we are need to be addressed, need to be healed.
How can we as individuals find the or nurture the kindness within us? Are there things that we should be doing to remember to behave or to
Mm.
choose to behave that way?
Yeah. I um, I would recommend um, as a daily discipline. I mean, well, I'll take a step back. Because we are social creatures, because we belong to this species, that is actually a very demanding thing. We are stuck with it. You know, we might have been born into some other species, but we've actually been born into this species, which demands of us that we behave kindly, respectfully, build up social harmony, maintain social cohesion, etc. That's our response. That's our biological responsibility, which then translates into a moral. Like so much of our morality, it comes out of our biology. So it seems to me because it is such a demanding thing, we need time out. Everybody needs solitude every day. Probably there's no fixed rule, but let me say roughly as a starting point, think about maybe an hour a day when we're just reading or praying or meditating or singing or walking or whatever we do, not as an act of self-indulgence, but as a way of building up our resources, recharging the batteries for the demanding business of being an essentially kind human. Now, the discipline that I'd recommend here, Jackie, is adopting what I describe as the death perspective, which is really to start by saying, what's it going to be like when the end is nigh and we're looking back on our life? We don't always know when the end is nigh, but most of us do. Most of us know that that the end of our life is coming. We've got a terminal illness, or we're ailing, or we've reached 99. We know we can't go much further, and we look back. And what happens when we look back? Well, the literature on death and dying is very explicit on this. We do not look back ever and say, I wish I'd made more money. I mean, the sort of cliche about this is no one ever says, I wish I'd spent more, no one on their deathbed ever says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. Well, that's very true. No one ever says, I wish I'd kicked more goals, I wish I'd worked harder. But what people do tend to do when they look back on their lives is say, was I kind enough? Was I a loving enough spouse? Was I a good enough parent? Was I a thoughtful, kind neighbour? Was I a loyal friend? Now, we know that those are the questions that come to us and sometimes disturb us, plague us in the dying stages of our life. Let's not wait until then. Let's adopt the daily discipline. I suggest it as a nightly discipline. At the end of the day, when we're reflecting on the day, adopt the death perspective. Was I kind enough today? Did I handle that argument kindly? Did I mistake kindness for acquiescence? Did I give in to someone where I should have actually resisted, but kindly? Did I discipline that child kindly enough? Did I disagree with someone, but I did it kindly and respectfully? Did I listen attentively to people who needed me to listen to them and so on? Daily reflection like that, I think, sharpens up the discipline and teaches us the habit of kindness. I think of kindness as like breathing, really, just a way of being in the world. You know, if you stop breathing, you die. Well, if you stop being kind, or if you never start, or if you don't develop it, you're not a fully flourishing, a fully evolved member of this species. So I think that discipline. I've also got a little acronym. I don't know how you feel about acronyms, Jackie.
I love acronyms. My favorite.
Well, this is a way to guide our thinking about kindness, and it's the CARE acronym, CARE. C stands for connect, which means always acknowledge people that you encounter, always connect, always smile or wave. Don't ignore anyone. Acknowledge their existence. That's C, connect. A for accept people as they are. They're not going to change. We're not going to change them. But our responsibility is to show kindness, compassion, respect as they are, not on the basis of what we hope they might become. That's CA. R is for respect. Show respect towards people, not because they're respectable, not because you agree with them, but because you share a common humanity with them. That's the basis of our respect for each other. And that's CARE. The E is for engage. Become what I was saying before about the characteristics of members of the Emanuel Synagogue congregation. Become a person who engages with the neighbourhood, a person who joins a local choir or a community garden or a book club or a current affair. But be there, because by engaging with our neighbourhood, we become aware of the needs in our neighbourhood and we're better able to respond to them. You discover when you start engaging that there are actually people in your street or in your apartment block or around the corner who are badly in need of a bit of kindness, or even just someone to pop in and say, hello, I just live around the corner, give us a shout if ever you need me. So that's CARE, connect, accept, respect and engage.
So very interesting. One of the participants said that sounds like being kind to yourself is the basis for enabling yourself to be kind to others. And I think often when we speak about kindness, we speak about it being something outward that we give to others. But how important is it to be kind to ourselves as well?
Very is the answer to that. It is the case, I think, that, well, that's really behind what I was saying about the nightly discipline or the time out for recharging. We do need, there's a good analogy here. If you're flying in an aircraft and you're attending to the safety instructions before the flight, you'll be told that if the cabin loses pressure, oxygen masks will drop down. fit your own oxygen mask before you attempt to help anyone else fit theirs. In other words, you've got to be okay. You've got to be sure you're getting your oxygen in order to be able to help other people. And kindness is just like that. We do have to nurture. We do have to nurture ourselves so that we are equipped to nurture other people. Now that doesn't. I'm repeating what I said earlier. It's nothing to do with self-indulgence. It's nothing to do with pampering the self, although nothing wrong with an occasional pamper. But it's to do with equipping ourselves to fit the oxygen mask to someone else by making sure ours is first fitted.
This is connected, I think, with your. You talk about this in the book, but also in another of your books as well. And this, I think, ties in with it a little bit, is this pursuit of happiness. And you talk about shadows and resilience in this book, but you've also talked about this idea that we feel we all need to be happy all the time, that's our goal in life and it's achievable. And when we're not happy, we're somehow failing. Are you able to talk about that a little bit in connection
Yes,
with kindness?
yes. I do feel very passionately about this because we are in the midst of a cultural phase where we seem to have privileged happiness above all the other emotions. And I think this is very damaging for us as individuals and as a society. In fact, when I was talking about those trends, Jackie, that have been reshaping us over the last 30 or 40 years, I really should add to that list the sort of cultural shift in favor of happiness. The pursuit of personal happiness is simply not a suitable goal for human life. We are members of a social species. The pursuit of the well-being of our species, the pursuit of healthy, flourishing neighborhoods, that's fine. The pursuit of personal happiness has got just about everything wrong with it as a goal. First of all, it fails to acknowledge that happiness is just one emotion on a full spectrum of human emotions, and happiness makes no sense without the context of all the other emotions. In other words, you don't even know what happiness is unless you've experienced sadness. You don't know what success is unless you've failed. So if you're going to be logically consistent, you'd say, in pursuit of personal happiness, I'm going to go out and find something that'll make me sad so I can be sure I've got the contrast. I mean, no one's ever going to say that. And yet the contrast is essential. And every point on that spectrum, not only does every point on that spectrum rely on the rest of the spectrum for us to understand it, but every point on that spectrum is authentic. And in fact, what our folklore tells us, what the history of the Jewish people tells us, what human experience of any kind tells us is that we grow through pain, that the difficult passages of our lives have far more to teach us about what it means to be human than the bright, shiny passages of our lives. To say that the goal of human life is to be happy, we should be, and as if if you're not happy, there's something wrong and you'd better buy our book or come to our conference or something and get happy. I mean, this nonsense served up by the merchants of happiness has led to a generation of young people in particular who've thought, well, I'm supposed to be happy, and there are a million reasons why you might not be for part of every day. So the drug culture is a very obvious response to the overemphasis on happiness. I'm supposed to be happy, I'm not. Quick, I'll smoke this or swallow that or drink that and that'll make me happy. Well, it's the shortcut to happiness. It's the shortcut to lots of other things as well. But the other thing I think that needs to be said about this is human beings, when we are, it all depends how you define happiness, of course. I mean, the ancient Greeks talked about eudaimonia, and that's the word that's been typically translated as happiness. But eudaimonia referred to fulfilling your civic duty, knowing your place in society, being prepared to make sacrifice for the common good. Their word comes much closer to our word wholeness than our word happiness. Living a whole life, or the religious word for that is a holy life, comes from the same idea, is all to do with the very things I've been talking about: engagement, kindness, showing compassion, acknowledging our common humanity, and so on. One of the things we know about humans, if we confuse happiness with pleasure or with a particular emotional state, that's when we get into trouble. Because we know, I mean, most of us have been at our happiest when we've fallen in love. Now, falling in love is a bit like an illness. I mean, you become irrational, you lose the car keys, your judgment is impaired, especially your judgment about the beloved, etc. It's not a good state. You couldn't sustain that for too long, or you'd constantly bump into things and forget everything. When you go into a department store, there's perfume wafting, there's soft carpet, there's beautiful music playing. This is designed to make you feel happy. Why would a department store want to make you feel happy? Answer: we are at our least rational when we are happy. There's some interesting research out of University of New South Wales has shown us that when we are not happy, not miserable, not depressed, but just not happy, we are capable of making better decisions, we're capable of communicating better, we are more creative. There are a lot of advantages of not being on the peak of I mean, of course, we all love being happy, but I think we've got to acknowledge when the bluebird of happiness lands on our shoulder, it's a fleeting visit, enjoy it while it's there, but that's not what life is about. Life is about the full spectrum. Life is about, and life is about, for our children, it's about learning to deal with disappointment, with failure, with loss. That's how we build resilience in our children and in each other. If we remove all obstacles and try and smooth the pathway for our children and promise them that they can have a happy life, we're setting them up for a crisis. And in fact, there's some interesting American research on that very subject, showing that children who've been raised in a highly protected, supported environment where life has been made easy for them and they've been promised happiness, as though that's their birthright, they do hit an emotional crisis the first time a boyfriend or girlfriend dumps them, or they fail an exam. What do you mean I failed an exam? I don't fail exams. Well, we have to learn that those things, and if we postpone the discovery that failure and loss and disappointment are possible, then they are correspondingly harder to handle.
It's very good that I have a husband raising my daughter with me, because he is that voice of reason while I think what they call a lawnmower parent, where I'm trying to fix everything all the time.
I think you might mean a helicopter parent. Do you mean
that too? I'm helicopter and a lawnmower. I'm doing everything. Speaking about the next generation, you mentioned in your book at the very beginning, kind of briefly, this idea of a COVID generation, that we're going to have this group of young people now who've had 2 years of very disrupted life. And I'm wondering if it's too early to tell yet, or what you think some of the consequences of the way that the last couple of years have unfolded will be going forward. Because one of the other things, I know this is like a long question, but one of the other things that I've been reading is that the people who have, one of the groups that have suffered the most actually through COVID have been sort of the young adults who have, finished school and or started university, like that kind of age group. So how do you think this last bit of time is going to, what's going to be manifest?
Yes. Well, as you say, we can't predict the future. We don't really know how this is going to turn out, but that's never stopped us from having a go at predicting. And it kind of sounds heartless in a way, but that's right. That cohort of young adults who've had such a tough time. They've often already been dealing with casualised part-time work, sort of a patchwork quilt of jobs. They are the offspring of our most divorced ever generation of parents. They've lived through a very competitive educational environment, very competitive job market. They're having terrible trouble getting into the housing market. We easily forget what a tough time they've had, and now they've been hit harder than most other age groups in our community by COVID. So my prediction for them is that this will have been the making of them, that this will be something that does build their resilience. And I'm drawing on a bit of history in saying that, Jackie, because through my research career, I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people from the generation who are now almost all dead, who were young adults during the Great Depression in the early 30s. And the story they told of that experience was very interesting. And remember that they'd probably already lived through the World War I and the Spanish flu, and then they were hit as they were coming to adulthood and perhaps raising families. They were hit by the Great Depression. And their narrative about that had two parts, very typically, not universally, of course, this is a generalization, but typically two parts. Part one, it was absolutely awful. You can't imagine what it was like to live through the Depression if you didn't have secure work, and unemployment was at levels we can't even imagine today. It was so high. There were virtually no unemployment benefits. We really did often wonder whether we were going to get a meal on the table for the kids, and quite often we could only do it because the neighbours pitched in and pooled what they had, and so on. Deprivation, hardship, a really terrible period of insecurity, and we wondered when it would ever end. Part two of the narrative, it was the making of us. We really had a lot of time to reflect on what's important. We got our priorities straight. We figured out what values we really would espouse, and those lessons never left us. And later in life, we became a sort of joke in our families. We were the people who would never throw out a piece of string or a rubber band. We were the people who would always bake a cake and take it to the person who just moved into the street to welcome them to the neighbourhood and so on. Unfortunately, we didn't transmit all those values to our children or our grandchildren, they said. But there's an example of values shaped through that hardship that never left them. I was talking to an American academic just a few weeks ago who had now retired, who had worked in London in the early 1950s, shortly after the end of World War II, and he said that he was surprised how many people said to him, "We really miss the war," which amazed him. And of course, they weren't saying we missed the war. What they were saying was we missed the sense of solidarity, the strong, powerful sense of neighbourhood that existed, particularly during the Blitz in London. Now, that was interesting because what he was saying was even something as severe as the Blitz, the effects of it seemed to have dissipated for many people. But younger adults, at their most formative stage of becoming adults, I think these are lessons they are very unlikely to forget. I think we are likely to see a COVID generation, rather like the Depression generation, who were young adults in the 30s. I think we forget. The other thing I'd say about this, Jackie, sorry to go on, but for most of us, we were ill-equipped for this pandemic because we'd had such a dream run. I remember when my mother became very ill late in life and was plunged into depression, the psychiatrist who was looking after her said to me, "The problem for your mother is she was too healthy all her life. She didn't have enough setbacks. So when she got sick, it was a huge crisis and it depressed her." Well, that can happen to a society. And, we brag about 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth and, isn't this all wonderful? Well, maybe too wonderful. Think of that generation who lived through World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression, then World War II. Boy, they knew how to deal with hardship. So I think we forget that this young generation of Australian adults that have actually done it quite tough. We haven't given them credit for how well, I mean, they've got very high rates of anxiety and depression. We know that. That's a real symptom of the difficulties they've been living with, but it will equip them. It will build their resilience, and I think we'll see them. I'm looking forward to them reaching positions of leadership in politics and business and the arts and so on, because I think the lessons they've learned are going to make them far more, well, far more, as with the Depression generation, far more conscious of their common humanity, of their sense of sharing, being interdependent.
What a beautiful thought. I really hope that that's a prophet statement, because I think that that would be really beautiful if we can move away from that self-centered kind of competitive thing to look at each other in a slightly more human way. I have one final question, unless anyone who is here has questions, just please put them up. But I wanted just to touch on the change in work that has happened during COVID, that people have had much more flexibility and different, those who were lucky enough to have work. How do you think that COVID is going to impact on the way we work and the way we look at work?
Yes, well, some anecdotal evidence is already emerging, Jackie, which I think is giving us a bit of a clue about this. Isn't it amazing that for decades we've talked about the need to be more flexible about the way we work? We've talked about the absurdity of everyone getting to, particularly office workers, getting to the office at 9 o'clock. So clogging our transport arrangements in the lead up to 9 o'clock and then doing it all again after 5 o'clock in the evening. Wouldn't it be sensible if we staggered the hours we went to the office and did more work from home and so on? And employers typically over those decades have said, no, that wouldn't work. You know, we need to supervise people. We need people to be all there in the same place at the same time. Well, the pandemic, the lockdowns have demonstrated, I mean, obviously some people have to, you can't stock supermarket shelves remotely. You can't be an emergency worker or a health worker or a school teacher. Well, school teachers a little bit, but not very satisfactorily, remotely. You have to be there. But for millions of us, we don't have to be there all the time. And what we discovered in that first national lockdown in 2020 was that productivity went up. Surprise, surprise, you can trust people to work at home. And people were saying, the individuals concerned were saying, I'm much more productive. You know, I don't have so much interruption. I miss the people in the office, even the people I don't like much. I find I'm missing them. But I can be very productive. I can get a day's work done in less than a day, and I've saved all that travel time. And I do have to remember to get out of my pajamas occasionally. But now we've learned that we can do that. I think that the model that's probably going to emerge is a hybrid model in which people who are able to work from home will choose to work from home part of the time, and employers, knowing they can trust people to work from home, and of course people can be in touch via Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all these platforms. No one wants to work from home well, hermits do, but most of us don't want to work from home all the time, because we do need the interaction with colleagues. We do need to have those incidental corridor conversations about how the kid's getting on, or has your husband got over his asthma, or whatever it is. All that stuff is fundamental to a successful workplace. But I think we've recognised that we don't have to be there all the time, and a hybrid model will work. And for employers, in fact, many large organisations around the world are now looking at this. For employers, it turns out you probably don't need quite as much office accommodation as you thought you did, because you don't need everyone to be there all the time. By the way, another thing I think, a really beautiful thing that emerged from our experience of the lockdown in relation to work was that many managers realised during the lockdown that the people that they supervise were doing it tough emotionally, that some people were having difficulty coping with the lockdown. And I've heard several managers say personally to say to me that they realised that they had to put a bit more effort into the pastoral aspect of management. And I hope that's a lesson that will stick as well, so that even when people are back in the office, managers will realise that the pastoral component of their work is always important. It's just that we needed the lockdown to remind us of that.
It's wonderful that you ended that answer with that, because Barbara mentioned, maybe it also has taught us the importance of treating one another with kindness at work as well. So I think that was a beautiful way to bring that around. And I heard a lot of people talking about how, because they were meeting people on Zoom, they were seeing in the background parts of their home life, and so they saw them as more like people rather than the person who you encounter in the office. I think we had a very separate work and life, many people, personalities and personas, and this kind of blurred the boundaries a little bit, maybe sometimes not in a good way, but definitely this way
we're all straining to see the titles of the books on your shelves.
Yes, I did make the mistake once of sitting much closer, and someone made a comment about one of the books. This is my we have many books in my house, but this is where most of my workbooks are, so they're pretty safe. Many of the novels I read are in another part of the house. You can zoom in and see. I just want to thank you so much. I can't believe how much we covered in the time that we have had together, but I so appreciate it. And just to hold up Hugh's book, there it is, The Kindness Revolution. And I highly recommend it, but I also encourage us all to be part of this revolution. We can, as you mentioned right at the very beginning, revolutions begin not necessarily at the top. It begins with all of us going out and doing this incredible work. So as I mentioned before, Hugh has a back catalogue of 21 other books that you can enjoy reading, and as I mentioned, I have many of them, and I know you're working now on your next novel, which I've been very familiar with all of your social commentary work, but didn't realize you were a novelist as well. So and what you were saying it was about sounds fascinating, so we encourage people to keep their eyes open for that to come out as well. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was.
No, sorry. I thought.
Oh, sorry.
So just please accept our gratitude and our thanks, and
thank you very much.
So appreciate your time with us today. And
thank you, Jackie. It's been lovely talking to you.
Let's go make the revolution happen. And I'll hand over to Marina for final comments.
Just wanted to say that we have 2 copies of Hugh's book, courtesy of your wonderful publicist, Hugh Haley, at Allen and Unwin, Hugh's publishing company. So yes, 2 copies of those books that we will be giving to 2 people whom we will choose from the people that have attended today. So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hugh. I'll hand it back over to you, Rabbi Ninio.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to being together in community face-to-face a little bit more now. We can come back for services and a number of activities, and but also we'll continue to have an online presence just so that people can continue to be connected with us in many different ways. So thank you again, Hugh, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and have a beautiful rest of your Sunday.